Every so often when I'm searching on the Google for undervalued, underappreciated horror films, monster movies, creature features, that kind of thing, you have one that pops out to you. One which you've never heard of before, one which you don't hear people talking about, but one which maybe deserves a look. So you take a chance, you pick it up, and 9 times out of 10 it's okay, with that rare occasion giving you a gem like Isolation or Splinter, or movies like that that don't get the recognition that they deserve, but they're actually brilliant within that genre. And this particular film, Digging Up The Marrow, which in itself is a pretty creative name, and definitely stands out, did just that. It stood out to me, not just because of the cover art, which looks pretty cool, but also because of the concept behind it. Because for those who are unfamiliar with this film, which was initially released in London at Fright Fest in 2014, is a super low budget, super small production of only around a dozen people working on the entire film. It only made around 10 grand, just under 11 grand at the box office, so it wasn't exactly a commercial success, but it wasn't really designed to be. It was a passion project for fans of the subgenre of monster movies, and this film is very clearly filled with the passion of the people involved. Many times in the movie they themselves discuss the love that they have for this kind of course, horror genre as a whole, but more specifically monsters, which I can definitely associate with. I can appreciate that, and I have that same love. I love drawing monsters, I love creating new creature designs, and that's actually one of the reasons why this film personally appealed to me. Because without spoiling anything overly specific in the plot itself, the concept of the film was actually inspired by a combination of two things. And you can see some of this stuff in the behind the scenes portion of the movie, which I would definitely recommend watching immediately after the film, because it makes you love it even more. But basically the concept behind the film is a combination of some very cool artwork, which actually reminded me of some of my own style of art, not necessarily the same quality as his, but I definitely draw similar kinds of thing, and it was drawn by a chap called Alex Pardee, who basically had this art exhibit called Digging Up The Marrow, and then that was combined with a fan, or specifically some fan mail, which was sent to the writer and director of this film, who incidentally is Adam Green, who directed another one of my favourite undervalued horror films, Frozen, which of course I discussed on this channel before. Excellent movie, which does not get the recognition that it deserves. And of course, as I said, Adam Green wrote and directed this movie. He also stars in the film, playing kind of an alternate version of himself. He plays Adam Green, director of Frozen, in the movie as well. And the concept of the film is taken from those two things put together, some fan mail regarding possible sightings of real-world monsters, and then combined with this Alex Pardee artwork, and then they made that into the concept of a film. What if someone like Adam Green received some fan mail, and then they decided to actually act on that fan mail and go and make a documentary? See the people involved, see if they're at least seeming to be legit to some degree, and then if you can ascertain that, if there seems to be some kind of basis in making a story out of it, you could get a documentary team out there and actually check out their story and what kind of evidence they have. And that's the basic idea behind this film. It's about a guy who sends that mail about what he believes to be real evidence of real monsters. And the basis of those monsters is actually pretty cool. It's based around the concept of basically deformed people, deformed children. And it raises a really cool question that kind of allows the concept to work, and that is, what happens to those kids when they grow up? And that's a cool point, because in real life you don't really hear about deformed adults. You just hear about deformed kids. And of course a lot of them, based on their deformities or various other complications, don't reach adulthood. But some do, and you still don't really hear about them. That's the essential concept behind the film, and I think that works pretty well. It's a pretty cool idea, and also, ironically, a relatively unique one, because usually people who are deformed in films, such as Victor Crowley, for instance, they're just stereotypical axe murderers. And funnily enough, speaking of Victor Crowley and also characters like Jason, the actor who plays characters like that, Kane Hodder, is also in this movie. He's not in it for very long, it's more of a cameo, and he's playing himself. And you have a lot of really cool cameos in the movie that any horror fan will appreciate. You might not recognise everyone, necessarily. I certainly didn't recognise everyone, but I got the gist that they were people known. I knew from posters around the people what they were known for. Many times I've seen the films that they were associated with, and that gives you even more context. It draws you into the film more, and it adds to the atmosphere of this kind of, not quite found footage, but handy-cam mockumentary feel, which the movie has. Now, the movie's less than an hour and a half long, and I can't recall exactly how long the behind the scenes was, but I think it was about 20 minutes, possibly a half hour. It's definitely worth checking both out, as I said. You want to watch the making of after. They discuss some of the creature effects in the film and some of the overall style and influence of the movie, and it helped me to enjoy the movie itself far more. And one of the things that it really appreciates, and I've discussed this kind of before on the channel, is you only appreciate the work that goes into creating things like this when you've done elements of it yourself. As a fan, purely watching something, you can never fully appreciate the work involved. And of course, unless you've done that thing specifically, you can never fully appreciate it. I don't claim to, but having done some much smaller scale things myself in the world of short films, doing those kind of effects and monster stuff, it helps you to appreciate the passion and the love that's put into a movie like this, even though they knew it wasn't going to make a huge amount of money. That just wasn't the point. So with all of that being said, how am I going to compare this film in terms of scoring to other movies? Well, I would take all of these scores that I'm about to say as kind of being in a vacuum, because although I am going to score it in the same way that I would other movies, it's kind of like a comedy film, in as much as, although you can compare it to conventional films, it's not necessarily accurate to, because the purpose of the film is just so different. So, for instance, if you compare a normal comedy to something like an action comedy, and then to a straight-up action film, all three are going to be significantly different, and so you could technically compare them, but you have to take it with a pinch of salt. And that's what I'm going to say for the scores with this movie. Because the kind of vibe that this movie gives off isn't as much something like, for instance, Cloverfield, where, yes, it's found footage, but it's found footage for the purpose of pure entertainment. It's not really presented as being documentary style, it's just a found footage monster movie. This doesn't quite feel like that. I would say that this feels a little bit more like Troll Hunter, for instance, which is a fantastic non-English movie, one of my favourites in that kind of category of film, non-English horror, and it has a very similar vibe to that, this whole idea of a documentary crew trying to see if this concept or this story is real. And it works very well. Of course, if you're into that kind of thing, if you're not, you may find it a little bit slow, but again, it's down to personal taste. So what about those individual scores? Well, as always, we have the story and the plot first up, and for the story and plot of Digging Up the Marrow, I'm going to give it a 6, because it wasn't phenomenal, but the way the film is presented, the way the story is carried out, the way the documentary is handled, the way that there is not necessarily always a smooth journey between not just the documentary crew and the guy being interviewed, played by Ray Wise, but also between the documentary crew themselves, which is basically just two guys. That was cool to see as well. It adds a little bit of legitimate drama to the film. It's not just for the sake of it, it's understandable. One guy has a little bit more passion maybe than the other, one is a little bit more level-headed, maybe one has more of an analytical mind, whereas the other's more of a creative mind, and those things do clash. That being said though, as far as entertainment goes, it's a very specific kind of taste that you need to truly enjoy this film. You need to enjoy mockumentaries, documentaries, found footage. If you do, you will. If you don't, then you won't. So the fact that it is relatively niched is going to lower the score a little bit, and as I said, it wasn't a mind-blowing story, but it was well told, and I enjoyed it, so I'm giving it a 6. As far as the characters, I'm going to give it a 6 again, because sometimes the acting in the movie, to be honest, was a little bit off. Now, of course, most of the guys in the film aren't necessarily straight-up actors. They're more editors, directors, writers, so that's understandable, but it actually wasn't a problem with the acting that I had. The problem was that I could see they were acting. Because obviously in something like a mockumentary, to make it feel as real as possible, you need the people to buy into it themselves and to act in basically a non-flamboyant way. You need to take all of the confidence that an actor would typically have and remove it from the equation. People need to make mistakes in conversation, as people actually do. People need to get angry at small things like people do in conversation, interrupting each other, not listening properly. And that is played well, that is in the movie for sure, but sometimes looks that people give, the way people say certain lines, certain little cliches, I don't know if it's purely intentional or what, but it felt sometimes a little bit too slick to be a documentary. But that's just a small nitpick, and overall I'm still going to give it a 6. As far as the visuals go, I'm going to give it a 7 though, because of course I love practical effects, I love makeup effects, I've said that a number of times on the channel, and I adore monster designs, especially creative ones, and there are definitely creative designs in this film, and even more so in the behind the scenes stuff. But to fully appreciate the creatures in the film, you need to watch the behind the scenes. And that's kind of the reason why I'm not scoring it even higher, because although they're used sparingly in the film, and that is effective, for sure, it's just a shame that you don't get to appreciate the full look of the creatures that much. Which is why I'm saying behind the scenes is fantastic. You get to appreciate the creation of the creatures, the way they were made, the way they were designed. Obviously in the film you can't really do that. But that being said, I have to reflect that in the score. So it wasn't bad. I like the designs, I like the look of the film overall. It wasn't shaky cam, it was well done, because he's a professional camera guy in the movie anyway, so I'm giving it a 7. As far as the audio goes, the music, the soundtrack, the editing, even the general audio of the film, especially with something like a documentary or found footage, it's got a 50-50 chance of being great or being awful, and I'm going to give it a 5, which doesn't necessarily sound that great. It's the lowest score of the bunch, but for those who are maybe new to my reviews, a 5 is not a bad score. To me, every movie starts with a minimum of a 5. 5 to me is default. That's what a movie needs to be to get a passing grade. If it's above that, then obviously it gets better and better, up to 10. And if I give it a lower score, it's under par, by definition. So me giving this one a 5 is basically just me saying it did what it needed to do. And that's what I felt. The music didn't grab me, it didn't stand out that much. In fact, I didn't really notice the music that much until the ending credits. And doubtless it was there, but as I said, it just didn't really grab me. And although some people may like that, for me personally, it's just not going to give it a huge score. But finally, for the entertainment factor, which of course is the most personal to me of the 5, the rewatchability as well is also of course linked to that, I'm going to give it another 6. Because although it's not the kind of movie which lends itself towards watching over and over again from an entertainment point of view, it's more the kind of movie that's based around that initial effect that it has on you, and it does that very well. So it was very entertaining from that point of view, but for rewatchability, it doesn't quite have as much. It's not the kind of movie that I'll probably watch again unless I'm going to show it to someone. If I'm going to show a horror fan this film, then I will sit down and watch it again. But if it's just me, then probably not. So I'm going to give it a 6. I think there are probably some people who would love to watch this more than once, but again, the style of the film doesn't really lend itself towards that as much as a traditional narrative would. But overall, as a tabulation of all 5 of those categories put together, I'm giving Digging Up The Marrow a pretty respectable, all things considered, 3 out of 5. And so, if that sounds like something that appeals to you, the kind of mockumentary slash documentary slash found footage horror movie style with creature features and monster effects, then yeah, you should definitely check this one out. But that's it for this pick overall. I'll see you guys next time, and as always, thanks for watching.